Good evening, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to have been invited to say a few words of introduction before the lectures tonight, in particular to introduce Ursula. Inaugurals, I think, are extremely important events in academic life. This is a key point in an academic career, recognising the achievement that's led to professorship, achievement in terms of research, scholarship, teaching, supervision, curriculum innovation, external impact, subject leadership, a whole range of areas, all areas in which Ursula has contributed significantly over the past decades. It's also a chance to celebrate with family, friends, students and colleagues. But I wanted to stress something else as well. It's an opportunity to share with wider audiences our research, how it fits in with a broader disciplinary field, but also, crucially, its broader societal resonance. Now, as many of you will know, Ursula has had a fascinating trajectory since she completed her degree in French history and education in Münster, already demonstrating that degree of sort of rebelliousness, preferring French to English. She's taught Plymouth, at Exeter, at Durham. Then she was 8 years at the Open University before coming to York 10 years ago. York, where, as many of you will know much better than I have, that I do, she's had a very significant impact, particularly in the area of postgraduate education, directing the departmental MAs, but also developing an important cross-departmental PhD programme in applied linguistics. I'm here, though, I think, to talk a little bit about Ursula's externally facing work, which is extremely important. Ursula currently works with two groups, the University Council for Languages and the Committee for Languages in Education. She's on their steering committees. Two groups with which I work quite closely as the lead fellow for languages at the British Academy. And Ursula is really known internationally for her sustained contribution to language learning in the context of global English. And it was obvious to me when I was putting together a group of educational researchers to advise the British Academy that we would turn to Ursula, who has provided invaluable advice over the past few years since we set up that group on languages at Key Stage 2, on the crucial issue of transition from primary to secondary, languages at Key Stage 4 and then post 16, and the broader question of languages across the educational pipeline. Now, as anybody who follows these things will know, and most of you will know, languages in the UK are in a really paradoxical situation at the moment. On the one hand, we keep seeing evidence of a real appetite for language learning, particularly through engagement with language learning apps. There is, at the same time, though, an acknowledgement that the UK has got to be understood as a multilingual country in its own right, with incredible untapped linguistic and cultural resources. So there are positives, but at the same time, there are real negatives. University languages departments closing and contracting, and then the numbers studying languages other than English at Key Stage 4 and post 16 shrinking. Now, faced with that set of challenges, there've got to be multiple solutions around public understanding of languages, around changes which many of you are experts in, to pedagogical practice, but also around policy interventions. And I think it's in that context in particular that Ursula's work has been so important and continues to be important, particularly in the very live context of the current Department for Education Curriculum and Assessment Review. And there are two aspects of Ursula's work I wanted to mention before handing over to her. The first is absolutely essential work on removing barriers to opportunity in language learning. Challenging the way in which languages are unfortunately slowly becoming the right of a privileged few. And in our policy work, we regularly draw on Ursula's research on improving the motivation of all young language learners, on challenging perceptions of difficulty and particularly addressing severe grading, and crucially on facing up to the disproportionate numbers of language students who are taught now in private schools. So that's one area where I think Ursula's interventions have been so important. At the same time, though, and this is where I'll finish, I think Ursula's work, and this is particularly true in her latest book, has set out, and I'll stop here, a set of much broader challenges about language learning in the English-speaking world, addressing that sense that global English is this sort of killer language for learning languages other than English. It's something we hear regularly at open days. Talented linguists wondering whether this is an area into which they should be channeling their efforts. Now, just before I finish, to mention Ursula's new Elements volume, I think it really is essential reading in this area. It challenges that received wisdom. She starts by saying, "Wer Englisch kennt, braucht keine anderen Sprachen." So that idea that whoever knows English has no need for other languages, and then not surprisingly, she moves on to demolish that thesis through comparison, international comparison, through historical contextualization, and asks those key questions: who benefits from language learning, and what is the nature of those benefits? And reflects in response on policy and practice, on motivation, and on a key number of attitudinal issues. Challenging questions, I'm sure we're going to hear some tonight, equally challenging responses, which mean, from my perspective and from the perspective of many others engaged in language policy in the UK and beyond, Ursula really is at the centre of these debates, and I look forward very much to hearing your thoughts tonight.
Well, thank you so much. It's going to be hard to follow this. I'm sorry. What a wonderful introduction. I would like to start by simply thanking those who helped me being where I am today, most importantly, my husband and my family. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And as Charles has already said, my trajectory led me to being a school teacher here in England, first of all. And it's fair to say I didn't have the best of times when I started, because I didn't understand why the students didn't like the subject. So Emma Ursula reminds us, studying in languages can give you a window into a different world, a new culture, a new way of expressing yourself, and a new identity. So language learning did that for me. I grew up in small town Germany, in a family where for girls education beyond that deemed necessary to educate a family was looked at with some suspicion. So languages were really for me an eye-opener, a new discovery, a promise that there was a big world out there for me to be discovered. And I enjoyed it for that reason. And I was fortunate because I experienced language learning in an education system that embraced Humboldtian ideals of education. So education for the purpose of intellectual stimulation, instilling core human values, and generally fostering intellectual development. Rarely did we discuss things like, what is this particular subject actually good for in my future? And of course it was free, including tertiary education. One of the things that I find difficult is that if I look back and I imagine myself as a teenager today here in Britain, I know I would not have had the opportunity to continue my language study beyond the compulsory, let alone at university. So it becomes more urgent today than ever to look at language learning in this particular way, this liberational way, not only because of the context of decline, but also because of two particular circumstances, global English and artificial intelligence. I would say a bit about both. Back to my students. Okay, back to my students. So they didn't quite feel the way that I felt about languages, okay? I started asking them, so what do you think about language learning in general? And because they were teenagers, they first responded in the way that all school subjects are a little bit uncool. But then probing further, they would say things like, well, I don't see the point. I will never be able to be fluent in French. And by the way, everybody speaks English anyway, right? So I discussed this casually with friends and family. And then the global English argument, so this kind of fallacy, English is enough, came up very quickly. I looked it up in the literature and I couldn't really find literature on this topic. And that puzzled me. Later on, I became an academic, and that was for me an opportunity to revisit that question. So one of the first things I did as an academic was a series of observational studies in secondary schools in England. So most of my participants were between 11 and 14. So this is the kind of things they said. For instance, I'd love to learn a language and speak it fluently one day. If you live in the country, then the more you listen, the more you pick it up. Okay. It showed me they were not necessarily turned off education altogether. When I asked students, what would your language learning ultimately be good for? They would first of all bring out the practical arguments. It's good for job opportunities for the future, like, or if you work in a call center and you're the only one speaking German, that's good, right? Very often, when learners said these things, it was followed by a caveat such as, but it's not the job that I will do anyway. There was a sense that these arguments were parroted rather than really believed by the students. Why? Because ultimately the learners knew that they were not developing language competencies to a level high enough to really allow them to do this professional activity in the foreign language. Okay. And then they had wonderful things to say about artificial intelligence. Things like, I think people will have a brain implant in the future, or Google Glasses with translation built in. Okay. Students also expressed surprisingly strong appetite to learn different languages other than the ones that we currently offer. Less surprising, perhaps, is that also students echoed the opinions of their parents. Currently, modern languages are actually the most elitist subjects to study at university. That is, if you take the measurement of who comes from privately educated schools. Okay? So that means if our students echo parental opinions, we are going to perpetuate parental attitude across the next generation. There were also quite a lot of comments about students' low confidence. Many students were convinced that languages were a really hard subject, especially so in schools that had the policy of selecting only the deemed more able students to continue with GCSE, etc. The final theme that came up was a surprise to me. Students showed me that they were acutely aware that the rest of the world was busy learning English. And then they felt it was unfair if they didn't make an effort. Things like, it would be quite rude to always answer in English. You should at least make the effort and show common courtesy and say a few things in French. Or in a mockery tone, yeah, we're going to their country and then we expect them to speak our language. To sum up, these observational studies showed me, despite low enjoyment in the lessons, students were curious about languages in a variety of ways. Rather surprisingly, students perceived it as wrong if they didn't make an effort, if the rest of the world was busy learning English. But no single student mentioned things like general literacy development or becoming more language aware as a result of language learning. One or two students only mentioned if you learn one language at school, it helps you learn a different one later in life. Not a single student mentioned things like, if I learn a new language and a new culture, perhaps the one of my neighbors, perhaps the ones that are spoken in my classroom, I may be able to overcome some prejudices and understand these people better. Okay, not a single person mentioned that. Following these observational studies, I then did a series of intervention studies. Oh, I think I should go on to, yeah, you can see here quite a few different observational studies. Following that, I then did some intervention studies, simply to find out if it's possible to influence student motivation at all. So by now we have a reasonable amount of evidence on what might work to change student attitude. From my work, British Council, British Academy, Roots into Languages, etc. So what do they say? Trying to convince students with the argument that it will be good for their career in the future, sometime, etc., only works with students that are already quite well motivated. Generally, it can be hard to convince students to continue if they've more or less decided that they're going to drop their language. Okay. In contrast, if I offered an intervention that was addressing the low confidence I was talking about, for instance, by showing them that it's hard, that every language learning has got peaks and drops, and by making them interact with students that were only slightly more advanced in the language than they were themselves, this had quite a lot of better results overall. A caveat, though, the school policies of selecting only the deemed able ones, or even negative parental attitude, can undo such intervention studies. The best intervention results, and perhaps to this date the only evidence we have of influencing the most demotivated learners, have content that moves completely away from anything related to teaching the target language. By the way, the most demotivated learners, will be no surprise, in my studies were male students growing up in areas of high social deprivation. It turns out that if you engage students in a whole range of general linguistic issues, for instance, what happens to your brain when you learn a language? How many people in the world actually speak more than one language? Do people everywhere in the world, children everywhere in the world, need to learn foreign languages? Why does French have 2 genders? German has 3, English has none. I could go on. Any of such general linguistic issues turned out to be highly inspirational and basically evoking curiosity for the topic of linguistics in general, and then after that in turn for the subject they were learning in class. Okay, so we have seen students are preoccupied themselves with the question why they should learn languages, and their own answers can sometimes surprise us, okay? I wanted to find out if the Department for Education had things to say. Oh, did I do something wrong? Oh, no. I wanted to find out what the Department for Education had to say about this justification for teaching languages in the curriculum. Shouldn't have touched it at all. Yes. I'm going to leave you a minute to read the text. That's the one, yeah. It doesn't matter if it's not in display mode. That's fine like that. Yeah, that should work. Like that. This is fine, right? You can see that. If we make this smaller. Yeah, that's it. Okay. I'll leave you a minute. Probably have read most of it. Okay, so I'm going to be careful. Which one does? That one. Very good. Okay, so basically, I wanted to find out these rationales from the Department for Education. Do they actually link at all to what people generally say about justifying any education, any subject, any compulsory teaching? And here I wanted to use Byram's 3 core justifications for any education, not just because they are clear and they're very simple, but also Byram is actually the first one who developed a whole set of holistic rationales for teaching something that is related to languages, intercultural communicative competence. Okay, so here they are. Human capital creation for the nation's wealth and economy, equality and cohesion, and providing people with a sense of identity. Okay, we have the pleasure now of returning to the text from the DFE, because what I wanted to find out is, in this text, is there any link to the 3 core justifications for any education? And I found that, as you can see here in the slightly blue things, There are things relating to sense of identity, intercultural understanding, cultural relativity, cultural enrichment. These things are mentioned. There's also quite a lot of reference to the things I meant here highlighted in pink, developing human capital for the nation's economy, usually material benefit relating to the nation as a whole. If I put it in lighter pink, that was because I wasn't quite sure whether it was for the individual or meant to be for nation development. Does the DFE have anything at all to say about developing equality or equity and cohesion? Nothing. We saw earlier our students, 13-year-olds, had something to say about that topic, right? Where does this lacuna come from? Why is this not mentioned? It got me thinking. I think this is because traditionally, when we think about justifying languages, it goes on this particular continuum. We have a continuum with enrichment arguments on one side, practical use arguments on the other side. So here you can see this. Traditionally, the enrichment type of arguments were there relating to improving the future life of those who are already advantaged. For instance, aristocracy sending their children to Italy and to France for a rounded off education. We might call this the finishing school kind of argument, okay? And on the right-hand side, the practical use arguments, anything to do with it is going to be better for your future career, you will be able to travel for work, for professional use, for development of national capital and wealth, and of course for national security, including defense. Okay? Right. Heuristically, there's nothing much wrong with this type of conceptualization on either side. Practically, there is. On the left-hand side, the enrichment type arguments, as I have said, have always been associated with elitist education. And this particular fact means that we will struggle justifying the investment, so to speak, for a comprehensive language education. Okay? And there will always be a question of to what is enough here and for whom exactly. So these elitist overtones on the enrichment side have led many educational thinkers to then prefer the other side of the equation. That comes with its own sets of problems, right? Which languages do we need to teach now for the economic well-being and growth in 10 or 20 years' time? How many students do we need exactly to be fluent in French, Italian, Russian, etc.? And how fluent exactly? Okay. This return on investment argument for languages comes with its own set of different problems. So all of this got me thinking, really, we start with very simple questions instead. And the two simple questions are the ones that Charles mentioned. Are the benefits for the individual or for society? And second, what is the nature of the benefit? Material or not material? Very simple questions. And these simple questions gave me this particular matrix. And in this matrix, you can see on the top left, right, and bottom left, the arguments that we already saw on the continuum scale. Individual material arguments, individual non-material arguments, the kind of arguments associated with enrichment and in the past, not only in the past, still today to some extent, with elitist education, and then the societal material benefits. What's absent in education context in England is anything in the bottom right corner. Societal non-material benefits. We know they exist. We have a lot of literature on all of these aspects. Global citizenship, intercultural communicative competence, increasing tolerance and social cohesion in countries, for instance, or areas of diverse habitation and conflict. This is Cannibal, and the book is freely downloadable, by the way. Okay, it's not absent everywhere. I want to give you one counterexample. In the European Union, the language education policy to educate all students in competencies to intermediate level in not one but two foreign languages is set very firmly in that bottom right corner. The aim there is to develop a sense of European identity and European citizenship, to increase cohesion of a social and cultural nature, and to allow increased mobility among the young people living in Europe. Okay, so I think this matrix can serve as a diagnostic tool to find out where different education systems are placing currently their emphasis. And we've just done this, and we have developed a lacuna in the English context. But the matrix can also function as a tool to rethink education and develop new education rationales and help people understand better the full range of rationales for languages altogether amongst our students, but also amongst the general population. None of the four corners of this matrix are really as neatly separable as they just appeared in this diagram, because really no one is an island. If we improve something in our personal lives, that means the people around us will benefit as well. You may learn a language in order to have some intellectual stimulation, to fend off Alzheimer in old age, and to show curiosity for other cultures. If you do this, the people around you are likely to benefit. These are the kinds of reasons why I think language learning should be an opportunity offered to all. The key aspect of all of the non-material arguments for language learning, whether they are individual or whether they are for the benefit of society, is they only work if the learners themselves are actively involved in language learning. Google Translate will not do. No AI translation, however sophisticated, can help us to remain cognitively agile, to be socially more tolerant, and to be more open to other cultures in the way that language learning can do. In other words, language learning really needs to be embodied in a most physical sense. A fresh look at these non-material benefits can also make us question in more detail which languages we might offer our students to learn. In neighborhoods of ethnic tension, perhaps those languages that are spoken by these different ethnic groups. We have lots of examples of research around the globe that shows us how language learning can help lessen those tensions. If we do that, the English is enough fallacy has got no room at all when developing policies. Good. So now we know where we might go ultimately, but it's still hard to get there because currently our students are not terribly interested in languages. So what can we do about that? We need to think in the same holistic way about language purposes as well as language motivation. We need to think about a motivation theory that embraces the activity of language learning on a social, emotional, and cognitive level altogether. Self-determination theory is one such theory. In self-determination theory, any motivation you might have to do anything at all is based on three basic human needs: that need for autonomy, that need to relate to other people and to the world around us, and that need for a sense of competence. We all are different in the way that we have these different needs, for instance, more extrovert, more introvert, and so forth. But in our language teaching, we can do better in making our students understand that their language learning engagement is actually meeting those core human needs. This will help their motivation and attitude. Okay? We can rely today on a good body of evidence to underpin how principles of self-determination theory can help to motivate learners better and even to develop motivational language policies. For this approach to work, we need to talk to our students about why they are learning languages in the first place and where it might take them. We need to be very explicit about the non-material benefits, really. This model here that I've got for you is a model of alignment, whereby conceptualizing rationales for teaching languages on the left explicitly emphasizes non-material rationales. Then we need to engage the key stakeholders, and first and foremost the learners themselves, but also their general environment, into discussing these rationales. And finally, we need to translate holistic understandings of languages into motivational practices. Here we have curricular, teaching materials and classroom activities that can, and in parts have already been developed to meet our learner needs. For instance, it is my belief relating to the sense of competence that we should stop immediately having schools selecting only the more deemed able students to continue with language study. It is demotivational, we know this. For a sense of relatedness, making students aware of the vast range of societal benefits in language learning, and also make them aware that the rest of the world is busy learning many languages and the rest of the world is multilingual. The majority of the world is multilingual. All of this can really help for motivation. And for autonomy, we have a really vast body of evidence that informs autonomy-related language pedagogy. So finally, I'd like to say this is not pie-in-the-sky thinking. We know it's possible today, and it's not even high risk because we are starting from a low base in motivation as well as in learner engagement for people beyond the compulsory learning age. In the National Consortium for Language Education, we have now quite a lot of materials that help teachers to develop CPDs and understand this better. And I had the privilege of delivering a CPD program on motivational pedagogy to those teachers. It is now freely downloadable on the NCLE website, and it's accompanied by evidence-based motivational teaching practices, designed especially for those students who, perhaps by dint of their environment, do not really fully engage with the purposes of language learning. So in sum, I would like all learners today to have the opportunities that I had many years ago. For this to happen, we need to help them to see languages as what they really can be, transformational. Danke, merci, gracias, that to you.
Thank you, Vernita. Thank you, Ursula and Uma. That was a treat. It really was. Having that insight into intellectual journeys, and I had some connection points. I'm a lapsed linguist, and I spent some time working with realist and constructivist perspectives, trying to puzzle out German politics. And the thing that struck me about both of those really quite different presentations was how much you both care. That was your language towards the end, but I think it was also the meaning of what you were saying about languages education, as it was with you about special educational needs. So a real treat, and I am sure our two fantastic professors would love to have your insights into what they have been saying and your questions. So who's first? Please, towards the back.
So my question goes to Uma. In terms of your background, did it play any role in, your career, whether opportunities, or did it limit the kind of opportunities you had, or it gave you more opportunities? My second question is, in terms of your solution, labeling, does labeling not have any good effects?
Okay, so the first question about background, I think the only real thing that I can think of, and Vernita and I had a discussion about this the other week, was as the statistics show for the UK research councils, people of colour are just less likely to be awarded grant funding from those research councils. And we know that grant funding is one of the criteria for progression. So I think that I haven't suffered from that. I don't think, but I can see that people of colour will struggle because of that and might struggle to progress. The question about labels, there are benefits of labels. I agree with that, because, you know, it gives people a common language. So if you say, oh, my son is autistic, someone else like, my son is autistic, yet they are experiencing different things, but there are some commonalities. So I suppose my pitch here was, let's ditch labels as a very extreme position, with the hope that we compromise and meet somewhere in the middle where the position that we're in now, where I think lots of labels are being assigned to actually quite normal everyday experiences. It's fine to be anxious sometimes, like it's quite normal. It's actually an adaptive response. I should be anxious right now. You're all looking at me. If I wasn't anxious, that'd be problematic. But we shouldn't be pathologizing everyday experiences, especially during childhood and adolescence where we need to develop those skills. So yeah, there's definitely value in labels. My pitch was very extreme, but I just hope that we can meet somewhere in the middle and compromise on labels.
Thank you very much. Jan?
Follow up on labels. I've heard lots of stories about adults in their 40s, 30s, 40s, even 70s, finding diagnosis like I'm autistic or I've got ADHD, very, very helpful, because they grew up with the notion that they're thick, they're odd, they are difficult, they speak too loudly, for instance. And so what do you think about that?
Yeah, so 2 points there. The first is that having a label can be perceived as helpful, but to what extent do we know that having a label has a positive impact on any tangible outcome? So for those people, for example, how do we know that having a label of ADHD in adulthood has a positive effect on any aspect of their life, other than it feels better for me, firstly? Secondly, having that feeling of, I'm a bit different, I felt very odd all of my life, and this validates my feeling. That's fine, but actually we're all very different. We have an average human being that doesn't exist, and we all deviate from that, and we're at different extremes. Everyone feels odd in some way. It's just whether you're at the extreme end of that, which is causing real impairments in you functioning in society. That's probably when you need a label, in my view. But if as an adult, you've been diagnosed as having ADHD, how is that helping you in terms of functional impairment? Has that helped you in any meaningful way at work or in your friendships or in anything? And if it hasn't, then what's the point of that label other than it's making me feel better? Because the problem is, the more we give labels to people who there isn't really any tangible benefit to them having a label, the more that label becomes, in my view, diluted, because then the people who are experiencing problems that are causing them functional impairment where they can't function in society, the services that they would need to access are being clogged up for all these other people who are like, I also have ADHD, I also need access to this service. Do you though? That's my thing.
That's quite a challenging set of words there, because we're always tempted, especially in social sciences, to try and impose order on the randomness of society by the use of labels. So I wanted to pass that question on to you a little bit, because in a sense you were building matrices so you can label things. How do you respond to that? And then I'll come back to Paul and others.
Yes. So my labels were about concepts. They were not about individuals. And a lot of my thinking, the more I spent time in schools with those students I interviewed, the more I understood that the labeling was not helpful altogether. And a more nuanced understanding was really what was kind of needed to really give the students the voice that was not heard. It had not been heard before about their nuanced thinking about languages. And I'm not blaming language teachers who are really working their socks off on a daily basis, who really did not know that the students they saw every day in class actually just wanted to learn a different language, for instance, or they were frustrated because their particular hobby had been going into the garden shed, working with the chemistry set and blowing things up. They had no language opportunity for learning the words relating to their identity in the foreign language they were learning at school. In a way, quite basic things that good language pedagogy could sort out in the future, but there was no space in the educational setting for allowing that to happen.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Paul. I think I saw an arm over there. Is that? No, not yet. There's one at the back there. So Paul first, please.
So it's a question for Ursula. First of all, thank you to you both for wonderful lectures. That was absolutely fascinating. So I'm interested in whether we should be teaching languages generically instead of a language in detail and specifically, and if we should be starting that at an earlier age. Does that idea fit with your work, and would that hit the kind of bottom corner matrix that you're talking about?
It's a model. It's actually we call that carousel teaching. So one term it could be Punjabi, the next term it could be Polish, and then Spanish, something like that. And this carousel model is quite successful in a number of different primary schools where the initiative has been launched to precisely do the community language teaching to lessen tensions of any kind of racial nature, and very, very good results. Reduced levels of incidences in the playground at playtime and things like that. The reason why it's especially good for primary school is that it prepares for language learning for future. It doesn't necessarily focus on the competency levels in particular languages, and really serves as a springboard for them going to learning different target languages in secondary school. So that's one really good place for doing this carousel teaching. There is no particular reason why carousel language teaching has no place at all in secondary school, other than whole system, assessment, GCSEs, etc. But in principle, it's a great idea.
Get rid of GCSEs then, yeah?
Yeah.
Now, I fear I may have confused our young guests' arm as a request to... No, I didn't know.
Our young guests have questions too. I wanted to follow up Paul's question. So students want to learn languages, and they can learn from learning languages. Which language do they want to learn, if there's one in particular, and which one should they learn to broaden their horizon the most?
Yes, a whole host of different answers to that. So a lot of our current teenagers are surprisingly interested in a number of Asiatic languages, especially Korean and Japanese. And that's related to K-pop culture and manga and sort of current cultural phenomena that are of interest to them. So that's one particular interest. But that doesn't answer the question, which should they learn? Because the question, which should they learn, can be answered from the matrix perspective in terms of the material benefit, non-material benefit, and a huge host of other benefits there. One thing we do know is that students in secondary schools are a little frustrated by the very restricted choice overall, altogether. It's either French or German, and if a school offers both, the children very often get forced and have even no choice over those, and that has to do with timetabling and teacher availabilities and so forth. So increasing the optionality generally, full stop, is definitely a good way forward. And in higher education, there's a massive crisis in modern languages, we know this, but the Asian languages I just mentioned, they are tiny, but they are growing. Yeah.
Okay, the next is the man with the blue jumper at the back.
My questions have been brilliantly anticipated by my colleagues.
Okay. Then who else is next? Over here, down the front. Sorry to make you go from one extreme of the room to another.
Thank you. Both our speakers tonight, I think, were doing groundbreaking work. They're living life at the edge. Can you both think of a moment over the last few years, or even earlier, where you wanted to punch the air with joy. You might even have gone into a tap dancing routine because you felt, in terms of your research, you'd absolutely crack something of importance to your own understanding.
So eureka moments. Uma.
I can honestly say no. Like I feel like I have a very large ego in general. But when it comes to my research, I'm under no illusion that it's not particularly like I have great ideas, but I haven't had the eureka moment. But I looked up my state retirement pension age, which is the 1st of May 2055. So I have 30 more years to have that eureka moment.
That's why 2055 was on the slide.
Yeah, I forgot to say it.
Likewise, I can't really think of one. I can think of many punching moments, but of a different nature. No, little glimpse of hope, a new direction with language education happening in Scotland, new modern ways of thinking altogether that kind of look a bit inspirational, but nothing really that's worthy of a punch in the air.
But that is the nature of the research environment and science at the moment, where you make incremental changes, and it's unlikely that I'm going to have a eureka moment, or anyone else really, probably in the next 30 years, but we might do.
I had the privilege when I worked in Edinburgh of knowing Peter Higgs a little bit, who won a Nobel Prize in the early 2010s, and that was for work he did in 1963, which, measured in that way, may have been his eureka moment. So perhaps you're wise to save it up.
Okay, yeah.
Who's next? Please, Charles on the front row.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you for two brilliant lectures. I really enjoyed both and learned a lot. But Ursula, I've got a question about enrichment, because you quoted that purpose of study from the national curriculum, which doesn't sound very promising, but it's actually a brilliant statement. Begins with their sort of challenging insularity and opening minds, but then you get onto the bit where it's sort of allowing access to great literature in the original language, and your heart sinks a little bit, because that's not, because it sort of fills into, it sort of fulfills everything you're saying around enrichment. You've just given that counterexample of appetite for Japanese and Korean through K-pop and manga. Do you think enrichment always has to be elitist, or can we imagine a different model?
Well, this is really, I experienced enrichment orientation as a completely, unworldly, very stupid teenager. Why did I have the privilege of experiencing this type of language learning orientation? Because the whole education system was set up for the enrichment. It wasn't languages in particular, it was all education, wasn't questions for what am I going to do with that when I'm sitting in whatever job I will have in the future. So I didn't come from a privileged background and first generation and so forth. The point that I was making there is that enrichment is one of the things that can be so easily enjoyed by all, but they need to be led to the water to understand kind of these benefits. And one of the light bulb moments that I experienced when I was talking with 13-year-old boys who were really totally switched off languages, when you generally talk to them about language issues, very general linguistic issues, they were very switched on. That can be the kind of enrichment for everybody. It's very much accessible, and they don't need to be reading Tolstoy in the original. That's not the aim. No.
Someone who had to plough through Goethe for A-level. I'm with you. Who would be next? Maybe drawing up on the questions front. Do keep thinking. I summarised
So again, we had this conversation today about what does impact look like, and oh no, I'm going to tell a different story. I'm going to tell the story of how is translation going, and we work to try and have impact at various levels, and we try and do that by having conversations in an ideal world with people who can make a difference. And we structure our funding applications and our research plans about how you're going to achieve impact. But actually, for me, trying to achieve impact recently happened in a completely random way when I bumped into the Secretary of State for Education on the train. And I texted Catherine and I said, is it appropriate to approach an MP in public? And Catherine was like, yeah, go for it. So, and the problem was I didn't have my elevator pitch ready. I had no idea what I wanted to say to her. But what I did say to her was, hi, my name's Umar. I work in special educational needs. Is there anything you want me to, is there anything you want to know from me? And she looked at me like, no, not really. But I sat down and I think I gave her like 5 to 10 minutes of this is what I think and this is what we're doing. And what was reassuring was she was on the same page, which was nice. So I think even some of the work that I was talking about labeling, the direction of travel in government seems to be we shouldn't be giving children a label to support them. But they're not, I don't think she was suggesting scrapping labels altogether, but she was saying, let's not wait for a label to support a child. So it's nice that that impact and has, but those changes that I would like to see happening, as in not waiting for a label to support a child, are already in progress. And a chance encounter with the relevant person made me realize that.
Great, fantastic encounter on the train. Yeah. Ursula.
Thank you. So yes, there are impact activities. So the National Consortium for Modern Languages is putting CPD out there for teachers that we have an opportunity to input upon. So they are very much kind of on board and trying to develop more holistic ways of selling languages as well. And we are currently in the process of curriculum review, which together with the British Academy, we are basically impacting on by as a joint effort of a couple of academics providing our input and steering the direction of the curriculum review. Yeah.
Brilliant, great to hear. I think we have probably one last question. Go on, please.
Hi both. Really wonderful presentations. I've got a question for Umar and then a question for both of you. My question for Umar, I thought it was quite interesting the point you made about the changing nature of the symptoms over time. And it got me thinking about whether you've discovered any evidence over the course of your research about the differences in demographics in terms of the symptoms. So whether in relation to gender, ethnicity, and any other demographics. You can sort of keep the answer brief, but in terms of differences around some of those symptoms or the manifestations of the mental health symptoms in relation to different demographics. And then my final question, which might be kind of a nice closing out question. You've both really wonderful careers and you've experienced opportunities and I imagine challenges as well over the course of your careers. And I wanted to ask what has kept you both going through that time. And so thinking about the sector and thinking about some of us who are earlier on in our careers, what has kept you going in terms of sort of words of wisdom that you might want to prefer to some of us?
Okay, Omar, can you take both of those questions and then we'll give Ursula the last word on the second of those.
So I don't think I have done enough research on looking at whether these symptoms and manifestation of symptoms changes through different societies and cultures. And I make this point elsewhere, which is we're all guilty of that. And we all acknowledge that a lot of the work that we do is around a certain part of the population, which is reasonably privileged in the first place. But then we don't do anything about it. We just acknowledge that we're not looking at it, and I'm part of that too. And then your second question, what has kept me in academia? Honestly, I have plodded along for a long time. At each of those stages on the timeline, I've thought about, do I want to do this? And should I just do something else? Do I want to be an academic? And actually, those thoughts are still in my head. So quite frankly, I think I'm still here because I enjoy the people that I work with. And I enjoy my job too, but like the people are just very nice. And I'm not quite sure what else I would do.
And you do have an extreme fascination with data sets.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I sympathize with the question, and I often ask myself as well. There's no doubt that you have to have a lot of resilience to stay on in academia. As Charles said at the very beginning, I do have a rebellious streak inside me. And if I get rejection after rejection for whatever grants and so forth, I just know deep down what, I want to get it, and I want to get it right. And so I just keep going, really, because I enjoy the challenge. Yeah.